now is good friend of Rebel News and good friend of Reality Everywhere, Tom Harris from the International Climate Science Coalition Canada. And there's a lot of things happening in the realm of climate science. I feel like we're breaking through some of the nonsense that we've had to live with for 10 years, 8 years, 20 years, depending on how you look at it. So, Tom, I'll let you pick. What should we talk about first?
Endangerment finding in the U.S. This is really important for Canadians to understand. The reason is that over the next few months, what's going to happen is we're going to see a lot more discussion of climate change science. And what's going to become apparent to people is things like this. This is the open letter from Richard Lindzen, MIT professor of meteorology, William Happer, professor of physics from Princeton, and Stephen Koonin, who interestingly was the person who headed up climate change research under the Obama administration. And they make some pretty definite statements. And this is going to be coming in support of the endangerment finding retraction, which we can discuss in a second. It says, in our opinion, the District Court of The Hague, which is where this letter was sent, findings that dangerous climate change and extreme weather are caused by CO2 emissions from fossil fuels are contradicted by the scientific method and only supported by the unscientific method of government opinions, consensus, peer-reviewed, and cherry-pick or falsified data. And here's where they hit the nail on the head. Science demonstrates fossil fuels and CO2 will not cause dangerous climate change. Okay, so they're very, very direct. So what we're going to see is there's going to be a lot of discussion about several things which support the retraction of the endangerment finding. But I think we have to, first of all, define what that is. What is this thing? Yeah, the environmental groups have been trying for decades, literally, to get the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to control carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act. And in particular, they've been pushing for motor vehicles to be regulated based on their carbon dioxide emissions. Now, at first, the Bush administration, they just rejected this. They said, no, we don't have the mandate. We don't have the authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. But in 2007, things changed. There was a court case between various states and the EPA, and it was called EPA versus Massachusetts. And the Supreme Court decided, in their infinite wisdom, that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases were pollutants. Okay, they were pollutants, and this required, there's no choice. This required the EPA to actually determine if greenhouse gases, and in particular carbon dioxide, was this a threat to human health and welfare? And that was a very important question, because if it is, if they decided it is, then they have no choice but to regulate it. Now, the interesting thing, Sheila, is we have to realize that 80% of all the greenhouse gas emissions that are put out by humans, except for water vapor, in the United States and Canada is carbon dioxide. Okay, so carbon dioxide, 80% of the greenhouse gases that we're talking about. So really the endangerment finding was asking this question. And again, the EPA had no choice. Once the court declared that carbon dioxide and these other greenhouse gases were pollutants under the Clean Air Act, they had to conduct an assessment as to whether or not it was dangerous to humanity and the environment. And they decided that it was. Now, you can just guess that who was president at the time. It was Obama. It was the beginning of his term. So they declared that, greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, plus 3 other fluorine-type gases, that these were a threat, and the words were, to the population's health and welfare. Okay, this was the decision. And that's the foundation from which they built all of these regulations about motor vehicles, about oil and gas, about industrial processes. It's all based on the endangerment finding. Now, it's interesting that Alan Carlin, who was a chief economist at the EPA at the time, he did a really good analysis to show that there was no reason to classify carbon dioxide in particular as a pollutant. It was not a threat to health and welfare. But the EPA ignored it. In fact, you'd laugh to hear what they told him. I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember the exact words, but they essentially said, well, your findings, your report on this endangerment finding is not useful. It's not helpful because we've already decided to regulate greenhouse gases because we've already decided that they'll be harmful to human health and welfare. So, Sheila, I always turn that into a bit of a joke when I give presentations. We always talk about evidence-based decision making. Well, what this is decision-based evidence making.
Right.
Yeah. So they had decided that greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide, was a threat. And so they assembled all the data to support this. But of course, it isn't. So the foundation of the policies that are restricting industrial development in the United States and reducing or massively increasing our price of cars and all sorts of things, this is called the endangerment finding. So what's happening now is Lee Zeldin, who's head of the EPA in the United States. Yeah, I know. You'd laugh. I love his quote. He's so candid. He's so straightforward. He said, "We are driving a dagger through the heart of the climate change religion." Which I say, hooray, hooray for you. So what's happening now is they've put out a proposal to rescind the endangerment finding, and they've published lots of material. This will undoubtedly be cited as well. But just a few days before that, they put out a report from what's called the Climate Working Group for the Department of Energy. And there were 5 scientists involved there. That actually Chris Wright, who's head of the Department of Energy, he chose these people because they were, obviously agreeing with President Trump, but also because they represented a spectrum of, expert advice. There was Ross McKittrick from Canada, which is nice. He's actually one of the authors of this report. It's about what are the real impacts of greenhouse gas emissions when you look at government data, when you look at actual science. What's the real impact? And John Christie and what's his name? It'll come back to me. But regardless, there were 5 of these scientists that I'll list later. And Coonan, he was another one from New York University. Judith Curry from Georgia Institute of Technology. Oh yeah, and the other one is Roy Spencer, because Spencer and Christie, they're the duo, the dynamic duo who do all the satellite measurements. So those 5 scientists put together a report, and they said some pretty interesting things. And the report is open now for public comment. What they said is, it may be that the detriments, the negative effects of these climate mitigation policies could very well be worse than any positive benefits. They also said in the report that just came out that the impact of American plans to reduce greenhouse gases will be undetectable. It'll be undetectable on global climate. And it's interesting because these fellows in the report, or I should say I'll send you a copy of it so you can actually put a link on. It's actually put out, the Canadians for Sensible Climate Policy have what they call the backup book, which is in fact including this letter. But what they said is that if we go to net zero in the developed world, it will bring about mass starvation. Okay, they're very candid, and they talk about why, and it's a very detailed report. But the bottom line is that Canadians should pay attention to this for several reasons. First of all, because over the next few months, and certainly when this goes to court, because it's going to go to court, no question about it, we're going to hear a lot more from people like Richard Lindzen and Will Happer and Steve Coonan and Ross McKittrick, all these people who are what I call climate realists. And so what's going to happen is the base of the Conservative Party, when all this climate realism is coming into the media to defend the recession of the endangerment finding, many people in the Conservative Party are going to say, well, what the heck? Why are we supporting the climate scare? Because more and more, we're going to hear that the climate scare is a mistake. It's scientifically invalid. It just doesn't work, okay? There is no threat from increasing carbon dioxide. There's only benefits. And in fact, it's interesting because in the DOE report and in this letter, they talk about the massive increase in crop productivity because of CO2, which of course is plant food. So that's number one. Because of the massive influx of climate realist science that we're going to hear over the next few years, many people are going to say to Pierre Poilievre, well, then why the heck are you supporting the climate scare? It's clearly a fake scare. You know, it's just like out of Patrick Moore's book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Prophets of Doom. That's his book. And he talks about how, in many cases, the catastrophes we're told about are invisible. We can't see them. We can't go to the north and count the polar bears. You know, we can't actually see carbon dioxide. We can't tell if there's an increase in extreme weather, which, by the way, there is not. And that was one of the conclusions from the DOE report is that we don't see an increase in tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, droughts. None of those things are increasing in the US. So we're going to see a battle royale basically erupting in the US over this issue. And the sequence of events is this. First of all, it's open for public comment, okay? And in fact, it is right now. And then the EPA, by the end of the year, will undoubtedly bring in the final regulation. And then the lawsuits begin, okay? The environmental groups are going to sue. They're going to sue the pants off of them. And it'll go initially to the DC Court of Appeals. They go to a small group of 3 judges. And if they decide to hear it, it goes to the full panel. And no matter who wins at that point, it's almost certain to go to the Supreme Court if the Supreme Court will take it up. And I think they will. Because think about it. If the Trump administration loses at the DC Court appeal level, you know, they're going to obviously appeal it to the Supreme Court because they want to get rid of this endangerment finding. And to understand how significant it is, the endangerment finding is responsible for $1 trillion of regulation.
Yes. 31 different pieces of legislation driving up the cost of everything.
Yeah. And $54 billion a year is what they say they'll save. So Canada should pay very much attention to this. It also demonstrates you don't always have to yield to the woke left. You can fight back. So hooray for Trump doing this.